In this segment, we will see how muscles go about making the ATP energy that they need to function correctly. So before we do that, let's first review how muscles use the ATP that they're creating. So in one place that it's used is the cross-bridge cycle, and during the cross-bridge cycle, ATP is used to break the cross-bridge and also to return the myosin molecules to their high energy configuration so that they can undergo another power stroke and generate more force or more tension in that muscle. ATP is also used to power the sodium-potassium pumps in the sarcolemma as well as the calcium pumps in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So not only are they used during the cross-bridge cycle, but they also power a number of the ion pumps that are within the skeletal muscle fiber or cell. So it turns out that muscles only make ATP when it is needed. That is, muscles don't tend to store large quantities of ATP and then just use it from that, essentially that bank or that storage of ATP. So muscles are not banks of ATP. And the reason for that is that ATP is a relatively unstable molecule. And so for that reason, ATP has to be used just about as quickly as it's created. And for that reason, muscles do not store large quantities of ATP to be used later. So it's not like they can fill up a fuel tank of ATP and then just draw ATP out of that when they need it. So instead, what muscles have is they have a couple of different pathways, 3 pathways to be specific, that the muscle cells go about making the ATP when they need it. So let's take a look at what those 3 pathways are. So first we have the direct phosphorylation, which is also called the direct synthesis pathway. We have the aerobic glycolysis pathway and the aerobic respiration pathway. So let's start with direct phosphorylation and we'll go from there. So direct phosphorylation or direct synthesis uses a high energy compound stored in muscles called creatine phosphate or CP. Now, this process takes creatine phosphate and uses ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate. So remember, adenosine diphosphate is the compound that remains after one of the phosphate groups is removed from ATP and its energy is released. And so essentially what we're doing is we're taking this ADP and we're putting a phosphate group back on it so that way we can make a new ATP. So this process uses creatine phosphate, since it has a phosphate molecule on it, and ADP. And what it does is it uses an enzyme called creatine kinase to transfer the phosphate group from CP to ADP. And in the process, we make ATP, and then the creatine phosphate, after it's had its phosphate group removed, is just referred to as creatine. And so those are the 2 products that we end up with at the end of this reaction here. So this process occurs without any oxygen. So even if oxygen is present, it does not require it. The yield for this reaction is 1 ATP per creatine phosphate used, and the waste product, as I mentioned earlier, is called creatine. So at rest, what our body does is it takes this creatine and it adds a phosphate back to it to make the creatine phosphate once again. So that way, a little bit later, this process can be used in the future to make more ATP. So if this were the only process that we're creating ATP in the muscle, we would have enough creatine phosphate to make ATP for about 15 seconds. But since there are other processes at work too, our body can use some but not all of our creatine phosphate during a single bout of exercise. So that's the direct phosphorylation method. So let's take a look now at anaerobic glycolysis. So the term anaerobic means without oxygen, and glycolysis means sugar splitting. So in this pathway, we're going to see that glucose is split to release the energy from that glucose, and this process is done without oxygen. And even if oxygen is present, oxygen is still not necessary in this process here. So what happens during this process is that our muscle cells take up glucose from our blood, and in the cytosol, or in the skeletal muscle cell, this is called the sarcoplasm, glucose is split into 2 molecules of a substance called pyruvic acid. This process releases energy in the process, and that energy is put into making 2 molecules of ATP. So if oxygen continues to not be present, so for example, when our muscles are contracting so forcefully that blood flow is momentarily cut off from certain parts of that muscle, those 2 molecules of pyruvic acid will be converted into a waste product called lactic acid. Now, lactic acid is then released into the bloodstream, and in the liver takes this lactic acid and converts it back into pyruvic acid, and then this pyruvic acid can then be converted back into glucose within the liver. It also turns out that both the heart and the kidneys can use lactic acid to make energy as well, so they're very opportunistic in that they can use this lactic acid waste product as an energy source for making ATP for their processes. Because we see that both the heart and the kidneys are very ATP hungry structures. Even though they're not big structures, they're very energy demanding structures. So this process yields 2 ATP for each 1 glucose molecule, and this process occurs primarily in the cytosol or the sarcoplasm of our skeletal muscle. So this process is not very efficient compared to the aerobic respiration process, but it is much faster at making ATP than the aerobic pathway. So this process is helpful for making ATP during short duration but very high intensity exercise like sprinting. So if this were the only process creating ATP in the muscle, it'd be enough to make ATP for about 40 seconds or so before those lactic acid levels got too high and our body needs to eliminate them. Okay, so that's the anaerobic glycolysis pathway. Let's take a look at the aerobic respiration pathway. So last but not least, we arrive at the aerobic respiration pathway. So you'll see kind of initially that this pathway looks very similar to anaerobic glycolysis because the first steps are the same. In this process, though, with oxygen present, the mitochondria end up using the pyruvic acid that's created from glycolysis, and the mitochondria can then make lots of ATP out of that pyruvic acid. So what happens is that our muscles once again take up glucose from our blood, or they use the glycogen that's in our liver or in the muscle. And the glucose is once again split into pyruvic acid in the cytosol or sarcoplasm of our skeletal muscle cell. This process again does not require oxygen, even if oxygen is present. So then what happens is our mitochondria that are in our muscle bring in that pyruvic acid that was created from the splitting of glucose, and the mitochondria bring that pyruvic acid into a biochemical pathway called the aerobic respiration pathway. And this pathway occurs exclusively within the mitochondria. And this process does require oxygen, but it yields a lot of ATP. So it yields, at the end of it, we get 32 ATP for each glucose that is created. We also see that it creates carbon dioxide and water as waste products. So this process is way more efficient at creating ATP than anaerobic glycolysis, but it is about 2.5 times slower to create ATP, which makes this pathway ideal for long duration but less intense exercise. And so this can provide ATP for several hours worth of exercise. This pathway can also make use of fatty acids and amino acids in addition to pyruvic acid, so it can take fatty acids and amino acids, bring those substances into the aerobic respiration pathway, and crank out ATP from them as well. So we not only can use glucose from this pathway, but we can also burn fatty acids and amino acids from proteins in order to make energy. So let's wrap this up by taking a look at how all these different pathways are used during exercise. So here's a good example of how each pathway is used during exercise. And this is only one example. It doesn't really encompass everything, but it kind of gives you a good idea of when these different pathways are used during different exercises. So on the left is an example of short duration, but very high intensity exercise. So in this case, this is a sprint. So within the first few seconds, the stored ATP in muscle is used. So that is very quickly burned off within the first 5 or 6 seconds or so. Then if that high intensity exercise continues for a little bit longer, then the direct phosphorylation pathway comes into play and starts to use the creatine phosphate to make ATP for another 10 seconds or so. And then the remainder of that sprint uses the anaerobic glycolysis pathway to make ATP. So typically during high intensity exercise, the muscles are contracting so forcefully that blood vessels serving those muscles are often pinched closed, and so very little blood flow can get to some parts of that muscle for a period of time. And so even if you're breathing very heavily during this, we find that oxygen is not being delivered effectively to these muscles where it's needed. So that's why the anaerobic pathway tends to kick in, because blood flow tends to be restricted to muscles during really high intensity exercises. So we see that the short duration high intensity exercise mostly makes use of the direct phosphorylation pathway as well as the anaerobic glycolysis pathway. But on the right here is an example of long duration but lower intense exercise. So think a long run or a marathon run, or even a 5K or a 10K run would be an example of a prolonged duration but lower intensity exercise. So really anything more than a minute would be a prolonged duration exercise. So the primary mechanism that we see is the aerobic pathway, which uses glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids in the blood to make ATP in the mitochondria in the presence of oxygen. And this process can be sustained for hours on end. And so often what we also see too is that the direct phosphorylation and anaerobic glycolysis pathways are used kind of sparingly within this process as well. So we do burn some of that creatine phosphate, and we do create some lactic acid due to those pathways being used kind of intermittently during prolonged duration exercise.